and welcome to Drunk on Tea. First of all, let me say thank you to everyone for getting me to 100 subs. It's always amazing to me that anyone wants to watch me paint models, but hopefully some of the tricks I've shown have helped you to paint up your armies, or at least given you some spark for creativity when it comes to painting. Long may the journey continue, and hopefully the channel will continue to grow. So thank you to everyone for watching, but for now, let me tell you about my life in Warhammer, where I started, and my journey to getting to where I am today. A commission painter who also makes videos on YouTube. I guess the journey really starts at a time I can't even remember. I had my first cup of tea when I was really young, and I've never looked back. I do remember I used to always have sugar in my tea, but slowly over the years I've switched to no sugar, just a dash of milk. Today I drink a lot of tea, so that's where the name comes from. As a true Brit, I am fueled on tea and self-loathing. But for now, how I was introduced to Warhammer. One Christmas, my older brother was given a copy of HeroQuest. This was the first time I'd ever seen anything like it. A board game, but with amazing, at the time, looking miniatures. I was a bit too young to really play the game properly, but we did go through the missions in the original game and picked up the expansions for it as well. Although I had no idea what Games Workshop or Warhammer was at the time, this set the seeds for what would become a large part of my life. As the minis came in coloured plastic, we never painted them. The game was always played with just the coloured models on the board, but unknowingly, that board game was the beginning of something that would change my life forever. My introduction to Warhammer. A few years later, after most of HeroQuest had been lost or broken, I went to a friend's house after school. I was at junior school at the time, probably about 8 or 9 years old, and he had a collection of orc models. They had a similar look to the HeroQuest orcs, but had way more poses and were actually painted. I was intrigued by them, and when he said they were for a game called Warhammer, I really wanted some models of my own. He told me about the local game store. There was no Games Workshop store near me at the time, so next time I could, I went there to have a look. This was at the time of 4th edition, that classic box of High Elves versus Orcs, so walking into the store was another life-changing moment. All of those models. At the time, I had little interest in science fiction, so the 40k side didn't really interest me, but the fantasy line was just beautiful. The boxes with the brightly coloured models on the front, as a child, just opened up my imagination. The shop sold second-hand metal models for £1 each, so I picked up 2 that looked really interesting with some pocket money that I had. The guy behind the counter told me that they were Chaos Warriors. I thought they were just the coolest looking models, and so heavy as well. And that was how my journey into Warhammer started. Now I had 2 models, but they were just plain metal. My parents picked up the classic starter set for me a few days later, and I started trying to paint. This was long before YouTube, so all I had was the paints in the set and the tiny little fold-out guide telling you how to paint the included Space Marine and Chaos Warrior. Obviously I took it as a sign that the paints coming with a Chaos Warrior means Chaos was clearly the army for me. The first trips into painting didn't exactly go well. I followed the instructions and painted the model white, but being a child and not understanding the concept of 2 thin coats resulted in some pretty horrid looking models. As anyone who knows those classic paints, the coverage wasn't great. So being an impatient child, the idea of 2 or more thin coats seemed stupid to me. So I went for 1 thick coat to try and get the colours to actually show. The models looked awful, but at the time I was happy with my results. I now had 3 Chaos Warriors ready to fight with. Unfortunately, I've lost these models over the years, but I do somehow still have the 4th model I ever painted, the Space Marine from the paint set. So if anyone wants to see what an early Drunk on Tea model looked like, here it is. I've learned a lot in the many years since then. Over the next few years, I grew my Chaos army, adding in more warriors, beastmen and demons. Although I never owned that 4th edition starter set, the imagery of it always brings back fond memories for me. Then came the release of 5th edition Fantasy, Lizardmen and Bretonnians. It was time to collect my second army. My friend also switched up from Orcs to Lizardmen at this time, as I moved away from Chaos and to the Bretonnians. I'm not going to say my painting had improved in this time. I was still far too impatient, so most models were coming out as a blobby mess. But my brush control was improving, so the thick paint was ending up at least roughly in the areas that I wanted it. It was also at this time that I started to branch out into other worlds by Games Workshop. My first introduction to 40k was actually through Epic 40,000. After having an intro game at a GW store, I really enjoyed the mass scale of the armies, and the game was really fun to play. It was like Command and Conquer, loads of tanks and troops all over the battlefield. So I picked up the starter set for it. My friend bought the Space Marines off me, and I played as the Orcs, causing destruction all over the tiny scenery. At this time, another friend had started playing Necromunda. The smaller model count, but campaign style of play really interested me. Watching the gang get stronger as games went on, and the pain of your favourite character dying was a whole new dimension to gaming that I hadn't thought of before. As I was starting to add the odd game of Necromunda to the rotation between fantasy battles and epic, GorkaMorka was released. I fell in love with the crazy concept of the game straight away. Necromunda style campaigns, but with the orcs and vehicles made up of scrap. I remember getting the starter set, thinking how cool it was. It had the cardboard scenery like Necromunda, but also those awesome looking orc bikes and buggies. For a while, that was my Warhammer gaming, switching between fantasy with my Bretonnians and Chaos, Epic 40,000, Necromunda, and GorkaMorka. Playing 40k still didn't really interest me. I would see the models in White Dwarf and think they looked cool, but the game itself didn't really interest me. I had Epic for the large battles like that, and Necromunda and GorkaMorka for the small battles. I didn't need anything in the middle. I would love to say that my painting improved during this time, and I'm sure that it did. I do remember accidentally discovering dry brushing when I was trying to pick out some details, and I found that by flicking the brush over the model, it just painted the raised details. I was still too impatient when painting, but I made a switch from too much paint on a model to too little. Rather than clog all the details with thick paint, I was using much less and thinner. I just never bothered to add more layers to build up coverage, so most of my models from this time have very see-through paint jobs. The first drop-off. As I moved from junior school to senior school, I started to fall out of Warhammer. Other things in life started to take priority. The usual things that teenage boys put as a priority. Music, video games, and girls. So Warhammer fell out of my life for a while. I didn't pick up a paintbrush for a few years, and moved on to other interests. The Lord of the Rings. So, it's late 2001. Lord of the Rings fever has taken over the world. All of this brings back memories of my previous dives into fantasy worlds. Plus, of course, now it was cool. In Fantasy Fever, I dug out some of my old models. I was shocked that I ever considered the paint jobs to be any good, and had some fond memories. A lot of the paints were still in good condition, props to classic GW paint pots, and I tried my hand at some of the old models that I'd never painted. Yeah, I have a pile of shame that stretches back to the 90s. I wasn't fully back into the hobby by any means. I still had a lot going on in my life. Well, what a teenager thinks is a lot, so some homework, playing video games and trying to keep some level of street cred. But I dipped back and forth into painting up the old model every now and then. At some point during this time, I walked past a GW store and saw advertising for Lord of the Rings in the window. I'd somehow missed the Battle Companies in Middle-earth magazine that seemed to be a lot of people's introduction to the game. But I picked up some Uruk-hai models because the meeting of the two worlds of Lord of the Rings and Warhammer was just too much to pass up. Although I didn't play a lot of games at this time, I picked up a few models here and there that I liked the look of and would paint them. This is where I would say my painting started to improve. I'd learnt to add a couple of coats of paint so coverage was getting better, without also filling in the details. Also, there was a switch in the way White Dwarf was giving its painting guides. Undercoating in black was a huge game changer for me. No longer was I leaving white showing through like a beacon between the colours. Now I could intentionally leave a little bit of the black showing through as a black line. With models like the Uruk-hai Scouts, this was almost essential, as most of the models are just different shades of brown. I was starting to enjoy painting a lot more as well, because I wasn't really playing the game much. I was painting for the fun of painting, not just to get models ready for a game. The second drop-off. After a few years of Return of the King coming out and people starting to move on from Lord of the Rings, as did I. I'd moved on from school to college, left college and started my first proper job. I didn't have the time anymore. Occasionally I'd pick up a copy of White Dwarf and have a read. I had a quick burst of interest again when I saw a friend had a collection of Lord of the Rings miniatures and we ended up having a few games, but I never really got back into the hobby in a big way until the next fantasy behemoth hit the scene. Game of Thrones. When a Game of Thrones hit in 2011, fantasy was cool again. It wasn't quite the instant impact of Lord of the Rings, but a load of my friends were into the show and reading the books. Yes, I was one of those people that had read all of the books, so knew what was going to happen through the seasons. Well, until they overtook the books. I'm still waiting for Winds of Winter, George R.R. Martin. My friends and I would talk about Game of Thrones, and in one of the conversations, someone said how cool it would be if there was a game to play. Now, this was a long time before the Song of Ice and Fire miniatures game would come out, but it reminded me of my Lord of the Rings models, and I said we could play something similar using them, or revisiting Middle-earth wouldn't be a bad thing. After all, it had been 10 years since Fellowship had come out. By this point I'd moved out, and all of my old models had been put into boxes and left at my parents' house. A lot of the Warhammer Fantasy stuff had been lost or damaged over the years, but the Lord of the Rings stuff was still in quite good condition. On one trip back home I grabbed the boxes of Lord of the Rings models and set about arranging them to play some games with friends. I decided to pop into a Games Workshop store, as I now lived in a city that had one in easy access to me, and see if they were still doing the Lord of the Rings models, and to my surprise, they were. The game hadn't really changed much, but there was quite a few new models out, so I picked up some models and played my first game in several years. One friend really got into the game and started to collect his own army. Now I was in a position of having some disposable income. I had my work-life balance sorted out to a level where I had the free time to paint and play again. I was picking up models I liked the look of rather than focusing on a specific force, although I was playing with my Isengard and building up a Rohan army, but also enjoying painting the models I liked the look of. Every couple of weeks I would have some games, and in between I was painting minis and really starting to improve my painting. I was able to replicate the look of the film fairly well onto my mini. Although I often didn't bother to go for edge highlights or focus on extreme detail, I was able to get the models looking to a level I was happy with again. Then, at the end of 2012, another big fantasy movie came out. The Hobbit. Now, myself and my friends have been back into the Lord of the Rings for over a year now. We were excited for the Hobbit movies, a return to Middle-earth on the big screen, and Peter Jackson was directing. What could go wrong? In the build-up to the movies, I'd seen that GW was releasing a new starter set. Granted, the name change for it was awful. The Hobbit, an unexpected journey strategy battle game, doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but we were excited for what was going to come. I'm not going to get into film reviews here, but the first Hobbit film is enjoyable. I excitedly watched it in the cinema, and it was a return to the world of Tolkien. As a massive fan of the book, it was nice to see the characters I grew up with on screen. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but I felt like the trilogy had potential, even if it wasn't quite up to par with The Lord of the Rings. Once the new starter set came out, I picked it up on release day, read the rulebook, and I was excited to try out some of the new mechanics. I remember thinking that the monsters' brutal power attacks were going to be a real game changer, especially as I often used trolls in my Isengard force. I was enjoying the new iteration of the game. Unfortunately, there didn't seem to be much of a buzz around the game. My gaming friends were looking forward to what would happen with the release of the second movie, expecting an updated starter set like happened with the Lord of the Rings movies. But it never came. The Escape from Goblin Town set was still there, sitting on the shelves, and in general, new releases were incredibly slow. We kept on playing, picking up models for our existing armies, but there was definitely a feel that the game wasn't being given the love that it had been with the Lord of the Rings movies. As the films just weren't up to the standard of what came before, we all slowly started to drift away again into other things once more. Eventually, we all kind of stopped playing again. Everything was packed up for one last time, and once again I drifted out of the hobby and into other things. The third drop-off. After the Battle of the Five Armies had pretty much killed everyone's excitement for things Middle-earth related, all of my models were packed away again. I continued leading a pretty standard life for a while, until one freezing cold winter, I decided I'd had enough of defrosting my car to get to work, so I was going to leave for a sunnier life. I applied for a working holiday visa in Australia, and after one last summer, I left most of my belongings, including my miniatures, at my parents' and went to the land down under. Anyone who knows much about GW's pricing will know that wasn't a place I was going to randomly get back into Warhammer. However, I did pick up a couple of Black Library 40K books. One was on the shelf at a hostel I was staying at. Reading the stories set in the 41st millennium did bring back memories of being a child, reading copies of White Dwarf, and although I never really collected the models, I did have an understanding of the world of 40k. While doing farm work to extend my visa in the middle of nowhere with nothing to do in the evening, I read more stories by Black Library in the 40k universe. After returning to civilization with a newly extended visa to stay in Australia, I discovered that my local pub was actually right next door to a Games Workshop store. Now, seeing the cardboard Space Marine in the window started to spark some imagination in me. I wasn't going to buy any models, it's far too expensive there, but I began to think about one day. I ended up staying in Australia even longer, getting sponsored with work, which was an amazing experience. Besides the price of Warhammer and the fact that everything wants to kill you, Australia really is an amazing country. Plus, at no point while I was there did I ever have to de-ice my car. But eventually, a combination of issues resulted in me having to leave the warmth and sunshine to return to the UK. However, before getting my flight, I did walk into that GW store. I had seen online the buzz that was surrounding 8th edition, which had been out for a while. I decided to pick up a codex for some reading on the flight home, and after reading some of the Black Library and watching videos about lore online, I decided on what army interested me. So I paid the crazy Australian prices for the Imperial Guard Codex and read it on the long journey back to England. Back in the UK and 8th edition. After getting back to England and settling back in, I bought myself my first proper 40k models. The start collecting box for the Imperial Guard, along with the 8th edition rulebook, all of my old paints by this stage were gone or dried up, so I picked up some of the new paints. The name change had happened during my last stint in the hobby, but it was still odd trying to remember these new names for paints. It took a while, but my painting returned to a level I was happy with. Luckily now the internet was full of painting tutorials and guides on how to play the game. Although I was never into 40k during my previous times in the hobby, I had played a few games here and there, plus GorkaMorka and Necromunda were based off the 2nd edition rule set, and through reading articles in White Dwarf over the years I had an understanding of the older ways the game was played. But the 8th edition rule set, to me at least, was great. Simple to pick up, but with a depth of tactical options and play styles. As I grew my guard army and played a few games with friends I was reconnecting with who had also returned to the hobby in 8th edition, I was really enjoying being back into the hobby. With coming back from the other side of the world, I'd moved back in with my parents. I was living in a small town and working in the local pub in the evenings. This gave me the daytime free to paint up the models for my growing army. I think a change in mindset, the quality of modern paints, and having the free time really allowed my painting to improve. I'd started to edge highlight and was enjoying being able to put on a podcast or something and just sit there and paint for hours. It was also good reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen for years while being abroad, having some friendly games and just enjoying all of the best things that the hobby has to offer. At the end of 2019, I decided it was about time to move back to the city, so the process started to find somewhere to live and start another chapter of my life, but this time taking the hobby with me. In March, I finally made the move. And then...
You must stay at home.
The pandemic. The world shut down. I just moved a few weeks before the first lockdown in the UK, so suddenly I had no job and nothing to do. This time I had brought everything with me, so during the crazy amounts of free time I had, I could finally sort through the models I had, some dating all the way back to those 4th edition fantasy days. I even found the old weapons rack from HeroQuest. With nothing to do other than paint, I set to work. I had picked up some Space Marines as a change from Guard, plus everyone has some Space Marines, and started painting up a Salamander's army, sharing pictures with friends over WhatsApp while we were all locked away, and looking at models that I'd painted up when I first entered the hobby showed me how far I had come with painting. It was at this time I started posting photos of what I was painting onto Instagram, and quickly found that I had a growing number of followers and people seemed to be genuinely interested in seeing what I'd been painting up. A friend asked me if I'd be interested in painting up his copy of Space Hulk, along with a load of Blood Angels and Tyranid models he'd built up over the years. Obviously, I jumped at the opportunity to keep me occupied and earn some money during lockdown. By this point, the hundreds, even thousands of hours I'd spent with a paintbrush were really starting to show. I was getting the results I was looking for when painting, my Instagram was growing, and I had people actually wanting to pay me to paint their models. With the release of 9th edition, I was loving the new models to paint. I was lucky enough to manage to get a copy of Indomitus on its initial release. Although it took a long time to get an actual game in, we did have a second lockdown come along at the end of the summer. It was great to see the hobby grow, and I was able to keep my head above water financially with my painting. At some point during this time, I looked over to the shelving unit where I had a load of my boxes and saw the Escape from Goblin Town box sat there. All of those years ago I'd read the rulebook, put together the scenery and models, but never actually painted them. I was playing with my Lord of the Rings models, so I hadn't ever got round to painting them. At this point I decided to pick up Thorin's company and paint them up. It was actually odd jumping back to the smaller scale, but I loved it. Posting the pictures on Instagram, I had a great reception to them. It even made my follower numbers jump up quite a bit. I'd somehow managed to get both the 40k and Middle-earth fans to take notice of me. I remembered the fun I used to have playing the game, plus a general love for Middle-earth, so I decided to pick up the Pelennor field set for the rules and the extra models. Half of it was Rohan after all, and I did have quite a bit of Rohan tucked away. Post-pandemic. As the world began to return to normal, I finally managed to play a few games of 9th edition. By this point, with all the extra rules added in, the game was already starting to suffer from bloat. It had lost the simplicity of 8th edition, although some of the changes made were improvements. It wasn't fun to have to keep looking at rules for everything. I didn't mind that my guard was using the 8th edition codex. I only really played casually with friends, so being competitive wasn't an issue. And I had a Salamander's army if I wanted to use all of the rules 9th had to offer. But I wasn't really enjoying it, and neither were a lot of people either. But I was enjoying playing in Middle-earth again. The rules had changed very little in the years, so it was quick and easy to get back into. My painting continued to improve, painting models for myself along with any commissions that came in. Spending my days sat at my paint desk are honestly some of the best days of my life. Seeing my Instagram grow and talking to people in the community has been such a great feeling. Plus seeing the progress in painting, how we all never stop improving. Even now, I look at models from a year or two ago and see the constant progress. Eventually, I decided to start a Twitter to share my painting on as well. It is funny to see the difference in the communities on the two platforms. It's easier to talk to people on Twitter, but I also try and keep myself out of the constant drama that seems to be going on. Luckily, the Middle-earth community has a lot less drama, like none at all, than the 40k community. So if anyone is watching who wants a nice chilled space to hobby, come over to the world of Middle-earth. They're an awesome bunch of people. I guess the final couple of steps on my Warhammer journey were when Games Workshop picked up some of my models and showed them off on their Twitch stream, and when my Aemir model was featured in a Warhammer community article. It was an honour to be shown off alongside such great painters in that article. I really do have a little bit of imposter syndrome about that one. And finally, the step that brought me here, onto YouTube. For a while I've been having people ask me how I painted certain models and how I achieved certain results, so I thought maybe the time had come to show off how I achieved them. All of those years ago at college I'd studied media and never did anything with it, so it's been fairly good to finally put some of those very dusty skills to good use. Making videos is great fun, and my imaginative mind has thousands of ideas for different kinds of content based around the hobby, that one day, hopefully, I'll be in a position to make for you all. But that is my life in Warhammer. There are parts I've not really had the chance to touch on, like playing Blood Bowl and Warhammer Underworlds, but I'm sure in the future I may be able to tell those stories as well. But thank you to everyone who has helped on the journey to get here, and a special thank you to everyone who has subscribed and watches my videos. Hopefully the journey can continue and I can get the opportunity to show you the ideas for content that I have. But until then, thank you very much for watching. Please drop a like onto the video, and if you're not already, please subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed my life in Warhammer. And happy painting.